complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side, and like messed up.
All right, Dan, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's good to be. I like that intro video. Is that England in about 2 years' time?
Yeah, really, right? No, that's actually I made it myself. I cut together, mostly, just random media, but also a big piece from Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, which is one of my favorites.
Cool. Yeah, no, I liked it.
Well, thank you. So anyway, obviously I have a relatively small audience, but if people don't know who you are, could you just give yourself kind of a notebook or a notepad introduction? Just kind of explaining who you are and what you talk about.
Yeah, I was a finance guy for many years. COVID came along, and I was on a career break at the time anyway, and I just looked at that and I thought I'm having no part of this absolute shite. And there were some other things that happened around the same time as well. There was the I have to be careful because of course you're on YouTube, but there was a election in across the sea from me, which was heavily fortified. And that was sort of the beginning of an era of techno-fascism, which we're kind of still in. After that, various things started happening in my country as well. And basically over that period, I came to believe that all of the notions that I'd been clinging to, such as democracy not being a complete farce, I couldn't hold to those things anymore. So rather than end the career break after the madness of COVID had ended and go back into a finance role, I've basically gone full dissident. All I want to do now is expose this absolute mess that we're living under. I feel like we're living under occupation. I think it goes for my country, the UK, and I think it to large part goes for yours as well. And so I basically started off with tweeting. I kept on doing these threads on what's going on and the financial angle to them. Then I started getting invited onto podcasts. And now I'm a sort of fairly frequent podcaster on other people's shows. I do have a channel, but it's not very good. And I am hopefully joining a larger sort of podcasting enterprise reasonably soon, but that's not agreed 100% yet. So I may have some more news on that. But anyone who wants to follow me can find me on Twitter at kingbingo_, which is a silly name, I know, but I signed up 12 years ago. And when I have more about where you can find me, you can join me there.
I've always been impressed with your ability to use Twitter for a productive end, because I have no skill on the platform whatsoever. And the most I can accomplish is just, kind of like saying something snide and stupid, from the back row. And so I'm always impressed when someone uses it for, any productive end at all.
You can have a lot of reach for that. So, I mean, I know, for example, that, a lot of journalists follow me now, and a few MPs do, but I know that I have a wider audience when I have sort of one of these tweets that does well, because I can see sort of people commenting on it, people with sort of more journalistic and political presence. I can see them sort of commenting or being referred to it.
It's interesting what you're saying about kind of like the wider impact of Twitter, because I think it's become very apparent, obviously in the US with first the Trump presidency, in the sense that kind of he acted as an executive through social media, but now we're kind of seeing the reverse through the Biden admin, where to a certain degree it seems like this marionette is kind of puppeted by millennials with Twitter accounts. So I don't know if you saw the minor news story about him essentially answering questions with ice cream in his hand, kind of mirroring a lefty meme that went around a few months ago, like almost to the T. And, kind of like the odd things where we're seeing, life, if Joe Biden can be considered a living organism, being forced to kind of imitate art, in an odd way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose he doesn't really need to, because, I mean, he's got the entire sort of news network of America behind him, as well as the entire apparatus of the state. I mean, I suppose there's Fox News, but and they are well followed. But I mean, he doesn't really need to use the whole social media thing like Trump did, because Trump was trying to cut through. It'd be interesting to see what happens with this whole Twitter thing, because I don't think that they can allow that is an existential threat to them. if a platform like that gets opened up, because it could lead to a competitive advantage of that platform over some of the other ones, and then Facebook will start opening up and all the rest of it.
Well, and to me, I feel like there's already been whisperings that essentially, USG through FINRA or another regulatory agency will look into Musk if he starts to move against him. They've been kind of quietly signaling about, oh, maybe we need to look into the finances of Tesla. Kind of like, and to me at least, that seems like they're kind of padding their belt, so to speak, and saying like, hey, play nice, or we might let loose the dogs on you.
Well, I mean, let's just call it how it is. I mean, the Democratic Party is a criminal enterprise, and what they do is they effectively move to make any opposition to their policies or indeed themselves a criminal act. So the January 6th thing is absurd beyond belief. I mean, I watched over the preceding 18 months to that period. I saw the left-wing Americans take to the streets, in front of the Supreme Court, and basically just burning cities to the ground on a regular basis. It was firmly established that this is a accepted part of the political mechanism, that you take to the streets and you make your presence known. And of course, what the right failed to realise is that completely different rules applied to them, and they've got those poor guys in solitary for 2 years now. And that is just one part of it. You see what the FBI are doing. They fortified the last election, which absolutely blew me away. I mean, that was really the start that turned me from being an establishment character who had doubts to being a full-on dissident. Was the fortification of that election, because it was so blazing. And I certainly don't. Go ahead.
Carry on.
Well, I was just going to say, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if in the 2024 election, certain key swing states, city counts, find that the FBI just march in and just take over the count. I mean, I don't think that they are prepared to lose an election ever again after what they've done. Well,
that's actually, to me, I think the big question. So I am at least currently a non-voter, because it realistically doesn't matter in my state. It's essentially we're based on where I live, my vote doesn't really matter. So that's more of just a mathematical consideration than anything else. But to me, I think these upcoming midterms are, I think, going to be interesting, because I think we're going to see, well, is this going to be kind of fortification forever? Or was this kind of a one-time move to stop someone that they, hate extra? And the move going forward will be essentially limit who even sits in the quote unquote opposition seat. So kind of what we saw very much through, kind of like the last, like American, I guess what we'd say, like dispensation, as Thomas talks about, the idea that kind of like there have been these kind of series of regimes. And, post FDR, at least in the US, because maybe there is something similar in the UK. I'm just more ignorant on, your political system. But obviously the Democrats were the party of power, and essentially the Republicans played kind of an empty suit role. They'd shake their fist, they would act all angry, and then they would essentially reinforce the positions of their opponents from 10 years ago. And look, like, I'm not the biggest Trump fan. I think he was kind of a silly person. He didn't get nearly as much done as he would have liked. But credit where credit's due, he was different. He was changed. He was a genuine outsider. And so to me, at least, I'm curious to see, well, is this, opening Pandora's box, and kind of from now on, the US is just a banana republic, where essentially we prosecute, the people who've just come out of power, and we, directly oppress our enemies, which, to be fair, especially when it comes to the IRS and the ATF, has been going on in the US for roughly 20 to 25 years.
Yeah.
But never this directly and never this overtly. And I think, to me, I don't know if they can successfully go back to normal. Like, it seems that they've kind of got the tiger by its tail at this point. And so I'm interested to see what happens, over the midterms, which I think is pretty much a sure thing for the Republicans. But really what happens with 2024, I think that will be a very telling election.
Yeah, I mean, in order to do what they did in 2020, you can't just decide to do it the night before. The only way you can get to that point is you've already got a mechanism in place. If you've already got your people who are sympathetic, and you've been able to basically propagandize them to believe that this man is such a threat, that a sort of a literal reincarnation of Mustache Man, that they are willing to. I mean, as we all know, Google searches for what are the punishment for electoral fraud spiked in those key cities. The exact same ones that happened to go offline at 3 a.m. So there was a mechanism in place, and clearly something had been done there. Now, if Trump is the candidate again in 2024, I mean, how do they not go to the next level? Because people will go to jail for the rest of their lives if he wins in 2024, unless he cucks out, which is definitely a possibility with a Republican. So if it's someone else, maybe it's less likely. But the point is, because they've got that mechanism in place, that there is, even if it's not quite that overt, there is the less overt version of that happening all the time. And who knows, what percentage a Republican actually needs to win by to win. I mean, do they need to win plus 5% to get over the cheating? Because that is probably what happened in the previous election against Clinton. He won by such an unexpected margin that the mechanisms they had in place weren't sufficient. But when it comes to 2024, because it's such an existential threat to the deep state at this point, if they have to, I truly believe the FBI will just march in and take over the count, because they cannot let him win.
Well, I'm actually more cynical than that. I can't imagine he'll be allowed to run. I think that the raid on Mar-a-Lago, which, so if I can, be permitted to kind of talk inside baseball for a little bit, I've been invited at the end of the year to appear on Millennial Woes Millennial Stream, essentially as a series of interviews that he holds over the last couple of weeks in December.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him, and it was basically like, okay, well, what do you want to talk about? He's like, well, like one of the topics that came up was essentially like like the summary of the year. So like, what is the theme of 2022? And at least from my perspective, like the stories that I think are really the most important are kind of and they're all and this is kind of one branch of that discussion, but it's, the 3-part story of the raid on Mar-a-Lago, Bannon taking I believe it was a 6 months or a 4-month sentence. And then Alex Jones being hit with, an absolutely ridiculous settlement.
Yeah.
And to me, all of those, we're kind of seeing that the soft power that the regime held for so long to essentially either coerce its enemies or punish them through more indirect methods. So instead of going to jail, you lose your job, or all your friends don't want to talk to you because you're seen as, socially undesirable. Their ability to kind of subtly use power, it seems that they're desperate. And, as they're desperate, much like a wounded animal, they're in some degree more dangerous.
Yeah, and it's always so disappointing the people on our side of the argument, because they fail to understand what is so clearly going on in front of them. I mean, if you remember, Alex Jones was the test bed for cancel culture about 2 years ago. Everybody sort of simultaneously took him down, and the people on the right, they could not be bothered to defend him because they said, well, he's a bit out there, so we're not going to make the case for it. And now just about everybody on the right is facing cancel culture. You need to be extremely careful about what you say at all times on any of these platforms, otherwise you will be cancelled. And everybody on the right is now talking about cancel culture. So again, Alex Jones is now the test bed for excessive fines, this sort of lawfare type attack method. And again, people on the right are saying, oh, well, it's just Alex Jones, don't worry about it. Don't you guys understand this is going to be happening to all of you in a couple of years' time? This ratchet, it's literally a ratchet. It's not going to go back the other way. So why aren't you getting this? But yeah. So more broadly, the point. What has been the thing? What's been happening? For me, it is just the last 2 years have been 2 years of absolute despair, because things were going our way. We had Trump, we had Brexit. We had Brexit first, and then we had Trump. Then in the UK, we had Boris Johnson elected. Now, this was a man who, for 10 years before that, had been writing in the Telegraph, and he appeared to be a real conservative. He appeared to be a libertarian. And the first thing that happens is he gets lent on to do these sort of CCP style lockdowns, and you understand that the West is an authoritarian state, but just one press conference away. There's nothing to stop us getting there. And now where we are in the UK is we've got this basically state-sponsored terrorism. We've got these propagandized idiots who are gluing themselves to roads, to artwork, basically just removing the ability for normal functioning in this country whenever they damn well please. And the police will back them up. if you deal with these people the way they should be dealt with, which is getting out of your car and giving them a bloody hiding, you're the one who's going to go to jail, not these people. So my answer to that question of what's the theme, it is we are losing on every front, and where do we go from here? Does something snap, or do we just get ground into the dirt?
Well, to tie together two things you said, it reminds me very much of that great, Samuel Francis essay, Anarcho-Tyranny. So
Yes.
On one hand, Samuel Francis is a very, early example of someone who was canceled. He was canceled by the right. I believe it was D'Souza, who essentially got him fired, and he ended up kind of dying in ignominy. But he basically makes the point that, look, like when states kind of enter this position where they cannot keep order, they have to a certain degree kind of lost the capability to do that. Well, what they will do is, instead of focusing on kind of the underclass, in America, this is very much the BLM crowd, the Antifa types. And I mean, I'm sure you've seen the mugshots, right? Like, these are not healthy, productive members of society. No. But when their resources are taxed and they're like, we can't really keep control. So there are a lot of those people, society is a pyramid, right? They will essentially pull back, the arm of the law there, and focus all of their attention on tyrannizing kind of the middle strata of society, people like you and I, because those are the people who really cause society to work. And they're the ones who need to be, kind of terrified of the regime. And on one hand,
it's easier.
Oh yeah, it's definitely easier. You know what? Like, you or I, like if I caught a felony charge, it would ruin my life. But if I'm already, living on the dole, not working, homeless and crazy, like, other than the actual time, like, realistically, like, I didn't have any job prospects anyway. So what does a felony charge matter to me?
Yeah.
And when you combine that with this kind of like creeping, like kind of like managerial technocrat, just authoritarianism, where everything is kind of like shoved into this like horrible mesh of like HR, big data, and and social media algorithms. You very much see, like what you said, that the government essentially has its own street level terrorist organization. In your case, it's the the hardcore climate activists. We've seen a lot of, at least in my media, across the pond, seen a lot of art being vandalized, people laying down in roads. And the US, I think, is just baseline more violent than a lot of Europe is.
Yeah.
Whereas our version is very much, like scrawny rich kids, sneaking up behind old women and, cracking their skulls with, bike locks or the like. But nonetheless, it's the same mechanic, the same idea of, oh, well, we will, basically knock heads in the middle class with our kind of like unofficial soldiers, that we don't have to really take, responsibility for their actions, but we'll kind of quietly condone it.
Well, these people know the state's got their back. They know that they're not going to do any serious time. That they do it predominantly in areas where they know that the prosecutor is basically just going to, wave them off. The thing that I'm more positive about for you guys is that, you can just move out of the sort of the loony blue areas. I mean, I think anyone who lives in America who lives in a blue city in a blue state, you're mad. Why? I have no understanding as to why anyone would do that. It is only a matter of time, if you're a decent person, that you completely fall foul of that. But what you can do is you can relocate to somewhere which is a bit more sensible. I don't have a super clear sense on what the sensible states are, but I kind of assume it's the if you were to overlay a triangle onto the nation, it's basically within that sort of triangle, the base and the sort of center point going up the middle. And I think you've got the opportunity for some renewal on that, because the governors can assert themselves. They can say we're not going in for this. And I don't know, what do you think? I mean, where do you think this ultimately plays out? Is it ultimately going to be a divorce of the union?
So that's kind of my hope. I mean, really, look, like I don't want things to go badly. If we could essentially have, the ideal divorce of the 1990s, like both parents go their way, they share custody of the kid, everything is as amicable as it could be. That sounds like, given our material constraints, kind of the best path forward. But what we've seen, and this is kind of the quieter stories from the Biden admin, is that all of these more remote communities are essentially being seeded with future Democrat voters. So for instance, right, I have some family in northern Maine, and Maine is, for those, from the UK or not from the US, is the northernmost state on the East Coast. It's incredibly remote. There's essentially one major highway running through the state, and the vast majority of it is dead empty. And it is I think, also the whitest state in the union by a pretty significant margin. There's really nothing there. But through kind of the Obama era and the Biden era, they've been seeding hundreds of thousands of Somalis and Afghans all across the state, essentially in an attempt to, depending on how cynically you read into those actions, turn a state that admittedly is a purple state. It's a pretty liberal, wealthy white state, but it's kind of a more sensible version of the Democratic Party, right? Like, for instance, one of the good issues to track, how right or left wing a state is in the US, right, is the laws on guns, Second Amendment.
Yeah.
So Maine is one of the states that you don't have to have a permit to carry a handgun wherever you want, because essentially they have no crime. There's no need of it. They have no population density. And
so this is the state with Portland, isn't it? The one that's gone completely bonkers.
Actually confusing. They are both named Portland, but not that Portland. So
okay.
That is a legitimate confusion. It is also a liberal town, and I assume that there are, kind of like far left loonies there, but it is kind of just by virtue of the fact that they don't really, it's just a very different state culturally.
Yeah.
It's essentially, if you can imagine, if you stuck Norway in America, that's a pretty good way to imagine it. Very similar climate, roughly similar population density. And so even though there's kind of a lot of liberals there, they don't tend to be as bad as anywhere else. Like, I think they technically have a Republican senator, but she's a pretty mild one. So they're not, my point is not to get into the politics of Maine. It's just to say that is what would be one of those states you'd want to move into, right? It's not politically important enough to be a battleground, really. It has 2 senators, or it has, I believe, obviously it has 2 senators, but I think it only has 2 representatives. But the point is, even that state has been kind of seeded, right? It's like, kind of dropped behind, operatives behind enemy lines. And you've seen that across the nation, right? I mean, even in my area with the US, and this is, I guess, if we can consider this another kind of like trend of the past years, kind of the contraction of the US empire, is that, even in my relatively small town, which is a very, very conservative town, we've had a few thousand, Afghan refugees essentially airdropped in, and I mean, and obviously even then, 3,000.
It's sounding more like Sweden than Norway, but yeah.
Right. Fair enough. Right. Even 3,000 people is not the end of the world, in a city of 150 or 120,000 people, but it showcases exactly. It all adds up, and it showcases a broader trend.
So here's the thing I don't understand about the US is you have a fairly strong state system. Why is Texas letting the people come across the border? Because I know that federal law says that they have to, and that their hands are tied by that. But why doesn't the governor just say, no, we're not doing it. We are just enforcing a hard border. Anybody who comes across immediately gets catapulted back over the line.
So there's a couple reasons, which Texas is actually an interesting example, because Texas it has been a Republican state for a very long time, and it's a very valuable state, quote unquote, as far as both the economy goes and the electoral college.
Yeah.
So the Republican Party in Texas is a machine. It's the same thing as the Democratic Party in California or New York. It's not really a party. It's an outfit. And I mean that in kind of the organized crime sense, not necessarily, that the governor of Texas has a body in the back of his trunk, but it operates like that, right? Like it's dirty pool.
It's a self-interested group that perpetuates its own interest, effectively.
Yes. And so Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, is a long-term party operative. And to be fair, what he did is he essentially, which is why I love Ron DeSantis very much as the governor of Florida, is that he essentially has shown a mold for kind of other Republican governors who want to be taken seriously, that they have to kind of rise to his level. And Greg Abbott was essentially what we call like a Chamber of Commerce Republican. So more along, not nearly as bad, but kind of more a Romney type. So essentially, Ronald Reagan forever. That's kind of the waters he was willing to swim into. And essentially, really the reason that they don't, at least as far as I can figure out, is that they don't care enough and they're cowards. That to them at least, they're relatively secure. Their state, less so in the state of in the situation of Texas, but in many cases they kind of have a secure job, and they're just not worth starting a row over. And so a lot of them.
Okay, and breaching federal law by turning people back and just sending them straight back across the border would be such a fight that's not their thing. They basically just want to have the dinner parties, draw the salary, do the drinks parties, and see out their term in office with a statue, on the lawn of some building somewhere. Okay.
And to be fair, what I think, and this is interesting, and this is what I consider, one of the few kind of shining rays of hope as far as U.S. politics go, is that we have seen kind of that governors are willing to make riskier and riskier plays. So DeSantis is kind of the right's golden boy for this reason, that he has kind of called the bluff on the federal government, because for a long time, there were kind of these big threats, like don't do this or else. And weirdly enough, this is kind of a positive thing to come of, kind of Bush era liberalism, is that we started to see places like California and Colorado essentially make breaks from the federal government. And I think that at least in the US, the Democrats being kind of the party of power, the right can copy the Democrats much more easily than it can kind of blaze its own territory. Now, that's not like a moral claim. That's more this is what happens, right? So for instance, the legalization of marijuana in the US is, was for a long time, you could have it legal on the state level, but not federally. So it led to a bunch of kind of like odd business situations where now you have these businesses that can't use banks. So they transact with millions of dollars of cash just sitting in warehouses, all kinds of weird stuff. But it did, to a certain extent, provide a blueprint for states basically telling the regime at the time to go take a hike. This is incidentally also what you saw with the sanctuary cities. Famously, this recently happened, with Martha's Vineyard and a few other places.
Yeah. Well, Martha's Vineyard was really interesting for me because what it demonstrated, it is easier to get Democrats to do Republican talking points than it is to get Republicans to follow their own talking points. Because, as soon as those guys turned up, it was like straight to a military camp for you guys. That is the sort of thing that you would expect a Republican to say, but they don't do it. Whereas as soon as the Democrats are facing that situation, they do not hesitate. So they have a willingness to use power, which obviously the Republicans don't seem to have. Because, okay, so look, this is the interesting thing for me. So I've got to the point in the UK where I've completely given up on the Conservative Party. I feel that they are. I consider them to be basically Blairites, and I've talked through on other streams about the evolution of how that happened. Effectively, what happened is Tony Blair came to power in 1997, and he ran an extremely sophisticated political machine. And the Tories were out of power for a long time, and they felt that they needed to become the beast in order to defeat it. And they basically all became Blairites to the point where they've actually changed their selection procedures so that all of the MPs are now these sort of big state Blairite characters, and that's why there's such a schism, and that's why we just replaced 2 prime ministers in the space of 2 months, because there was a huge schism between the people who were elected and the people who are actually the members of the party. So I've reached the point where I've completely given up on the ability of the political system to provide any solutions in the UK. I don't know where that comes from here. I'm genuinely wondering whether I'll be living in this country in 10 years, given the way that it's going. But my question to you is, the US is probably ahead on some of these incredibly regressive social trends, the censorship, the sort of the bullying. Where does it go? What happens first? Do the red states surrender and adopt this stuff, or do they break away? I mean, how's it gonna play out?
So I think that, and this is a very tepid answer, I think in kind of in the vein of anything else, we'll see a mix. So I do think that as we see kind of the competence of the central government kind of continue to fall. And I think that, I mean, I'm not naming names here, but you look at the Biden admin, and if you think sincerely that the adults are in charge, I have a bridge to sell you. But I think that there is a strong strain of essentially just incredibly weak Republicans for a variety of reasons, which is one that if you are kind of a Machiavelli, someone who is competent and interested in rising up the ranks, the Republican Party is a death sentence. That if you're looking to essentially make a name for yourself, and maybe this is less true now, but for the longest time, you were a Democrat, right? Like the Democrats were the party of the rich and famous, the party of the up and comers. And you see that in kind of like the leftward slant that the country's taken. So part of it's just a personnel problem. Another problem is that I think for a long time that no one, even in the party, viewed themselves as anything other than kind of a token opposition, right? They were the outer party, and their one role was to essentially kind of shake their fists. And what I think we're seeing now is hopefully, right, kind of a transformation in the Republican Party from, a single issue party along essentially tax lines to something that's maybe interested in brawling a little bit more politically. When I see people like DeSantis and when I see people like the Thiel crowd, Blake Masters, that to me is, and look, I don't think that any one of those guys is, the riding in on a white horse to save us, but I do see the inklings that there is someone or like some force interested in using the Republican Party to actually accomplish something, and kind of actually interested in acting in a adversarial manner. And so to me, I think that what we will see is as central power, diminishes, that hopefully places at kind of like the periphery, so places like Florida and Texas and probably also California, albeit in a different direction, will essentially start to operate like their own, political units. And I don't mean to say that there will be, Civil War round 2, where people line up and, form battle lines and take pot shots at each other. But I do mean that kind of in the same way that, DeSantis is technically still a part of the US and in all reality is, but also he'll tell Joe Biden to take a hike. He'll do what he wants. He'll redraw his districts and make it harder for his opposition to, take a swing at him.
I do worry there will be some sort of flashpoint that goes on. I mean, every so often you sort of see these flashpoints. What was it? Was it the Bundy Ranch?
Oh yeah,
the one where the federal agents all turned up, tooled up, and the other guys, they were armed as well, and it was basically a big standoff. And I can't remember how it was resolved. I think both sides sort of backed off in the end. But what if it's something like that? But this time the governor's got the back of the people in his state, and it comes down to a standoff between armed federal agents and armed locals backed with armed state, whatever. Marshals or whatever it is that that operates within the state. It's not that difficult to imagine there being some sort of a flashpoint. So I can understand why some of these older Republican guys, because I mean it takes a while to get, if you want to be a governor of a state, that's a lot of political favors that you've got to accrue. You've got to bring to yourself an awful lot of kudos to get to that point. So I can understand why it's an old man's game. And by the time you get into that position, a lot of the fight has gone out to you. Maybe it's a generational thing. Maybe some of these younger governors, they're not entranced in that boomer truth regime. They recognize the social battle that's going on. They see the sort of insidious power of the state. They're a bit more up to the fight. But I can still see that the risks involved of getting of basically that conflict moment that could happen, and it just come out of nowhere. And
to me, and if I had to guess, the source of that will probably be the National Guard. So for those unfamiliar, there's a system in the US where essentially there is kind of and they function, and this is inexact, I realize I'll have US soldiers jumping down my throat, but they essentially function kind of like the reserves, and it's a part-time program where essentially you go to boot camp, same as normal. And then I think you owe your state government basically 1 or 2 weekends a month, as kind of like an acting soldier. And then, the National Guard, which is headed up officially by the governor of each state, you were called in kind of in times of civil unrest or, a natural disaster, or obviously, during the the Great War on Terror, many of these men were called up to active duty. And so what you saw, and this was one of the last kind of major stories of the pandemic, which I don't know if you remember, there was this big hullabaloo about Biden essentially mandating that any company above a certain size had to have all its employees vaccinated. And that was eventually struck down at the court level. But what he successfully did was require all the people in the armed forces to get the COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
And what happened is that,
and I've got to say that's really clever on his part, because it is a non-partisan way of dividing, of basically getting out of the military all of the people who are, but he's basically partisan against you.
No,
so
definitely.
It's very clever on his part.
And I don't,
whoever came up with that idea anyway.
And what's interesting about that is several things happened. So one, in my state of Virginia, we were a big upset. We have a Republican governor. He refused to counteract that order, even though it was within his remit to do so. And so friend of the show, who's been on AA stuff a bit, Paul Fahrenheit, was in the Virginia National Guard. He ended up essentially having to give up his commission as an officer because of it. He couldn't get out of his obligation. And it ended up, causing him a lot of problems. Now, however, the governor of Oklahoma, which is a Midwest state, to the north of Texas, he basically told the federal government to go take a hike because they're his soldiers. And so look, like that, there was a lot of bluster, and who knows if the lawfare will ever be done. But he did it. He successfully did it, which kind of means to a certain extent that, well, he overruled, the central authority on, the military when it comes to his personal army. And I realize that's a very inexact way of describing it, but if that trend continues, kind of, and this is a very hopeful reading, like maybe we could see, those, if that kind of gulf continues to widen, maybe we can see governors, acting more, freely with their kind of private armies to a certain degree.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the thing that I'm thinking here is, I mean, this is not just happening on a national level to the US. This is happening to the US's global influence at the same time as well. So, I mean, I've been noting for several years now, take Saudi Arabia, for example, they have been ratcheting up things like public executions. Now, they never used to like doing much of that because they knew that the Western sensibilities did not accord with that sort of thing. The fact that they're ratcheting up demonstrates that they are less and less concerned what Westerners think. And there's even more dramatic examples more recently. As I'm sure you're aware, the US is probably one of their strongest trump cards is that the world has to buy and sell energy denominated in US dollars. And if they don't, they're going to get invaded. And this has happened sort of multiple times. Saudi Arabia is now just saying, okay, well, we're going to sell oil to China denominated in yuan. And the US sort of influence, and you can see this in a whole number of ways, those countries that are willing to openly criticize Russia for the conflict there. The influence of the US under this administration has basically shrunk to Western Europe and the Anglo-sphere countries. So it's not just within the United States borders that this Washington influence has been eroding. It's all around the world. But perhaps the bigger issue here is that this is the end of an empire, and things are crumbling on multiple fronts, and it is now up to Republicans in states to basically seize this moment or don't seize it.
No, I see what you mean. And maybe I think that my opinions on the Republican Party are pretty close to your opinions on the Conservative Party, where I've just witnessed such a shocking display of just repeated incompetence.
Yeah.
That at a certain point, it's like, I can imagine kind of a great figure coming from the American right. I don't think if he's here, I maybe don't see him, And so I hope that is true. But to me, I feel like there's kind of two kind of slow, I guess, like accumulations building in opposite directions, which is one, will kind of the regime lose power to hold on to its, kind of like outer territories. And I mean that kind of past the empire stuff to kind of core, like within the, technically like the boundaries of the United States of America? Or will essentially the US, dollar implode, at which point that, that process of essentially disintegration happens much less pleasantly, as kind of their ability to pay anyone, their goons to go. Obviously, that if the dollar collapses, that means that their power diminishes, dramatically, but also that everyone else's does too, and that kind of sets. And obviously, I don't mean everyone in the sense of worldwide, but I mean everyone in kind of like the U.S. sense. It doesn't really matter if if DeSantis has the ability to do whatever he wants, if his dollars are worth exactly as little as everyone else's, right? Because you still need to pay, you even if you have your army, like you need to pay them. And so to me, I realize that these are both, very distant and very kind of like improbable futures. But to me, that's kind of the two forces I imagine kind of playing out against each other.
Well, this is where the US has an extraordinary advantage when it comes to this sort of, pending economic collapse. Is the US is the world's largest energy producer. It's not the world's largest energy exporter. It's not. It doesn't export a lot. It consumes most of its energy, but it is actually surprisingly the world's largest energy producer. Particularly, in the post sort of the gas fracking, it's got an enormous amount of agricultural land. It's incredibly difficult to invade. It's got friendly neighbours to the north and south. So if it were to have, if we were to have that sort of financial system reset, the US would be. I'm not going to say it would be in a strong position because, of course, it would be a horrendous reset to all of our living standards, and ability to import, goods from abroad would be severely dented. But its ability to bounce back would be strong. You compare that to Europe. We are aggressively going after our farming sector because of sort of net zero agendas, trying to get the nitrogen balance down. So we're trying to close down as many farms as possible. We produce no energy. We've got rid of our manufacturing. We do a bit of financial services. Germany used to do, make a lot of cars, but they've turned off the energy that makes the factories run. And I look at the world and I think, okay, so what is it that I want to preserve? Well, it's my kids, and it's my culture. It's my sort of Anglo, however you want to describe it, but it's that sort of culture, and I think that the control culture, I feel certainly between the US and the UK is sort of a continuation to the other. I think we consume each other's media and can enjoy it. I'm sure I'd be perfectly comfortable in many US states. And I don't think that this is going to be. I think England is probably lost at this point. I mean, it's not as bad as France has lost itself, for example. I mean, they are just overwhelmed with immigration, and their culture. They have basically sacrificed it. But and so when it comes to the Anglo culture, if not America, where else? Because I mean, I think that for how to describe it, but my people, I suppose, we are looking at the lifeboats at this time. And if it's not America, I just have no clue what is left to us.
Well, and I've been on, AA's show twice, and the second time I was with one of my closest friends to talk about America and kind of like the West more broadly, and it was broadly well received. But I did have a contingent of people saying like, oh, you're black pilled, like, oh, you're you view this as hopeless.
When was that?
It was fairly recently. It was a cigar stream. I think it was the last one he did on America. I believe that was last week. Okay. But my point is that like there kind of comes a point where it's like you do have to look yourself in the mirror, and look at it honestly. And obviously there's kind of this, and to agree, I think it's like kind of masturbatory in a certain sense of despair, right? It's like, oh, like woe is me, it's all pointless. And there's something kind of comforting in that, and that it absolves you from responsibility, right? If it's all pointless, you don't have to try, and you can't be blamed for not trying. And that's not my point at all. But to me, I sort of feel like if you can forgive a tortured metaphor, if America is, kind of a man in his, his 50s who's, used to be kind of like the high school quarterback, and now he's kind of fat and washed up, and, he's got a drinking problem and he's not doing so well. Then to a certain degree, England is his grandfather or his father with dementia.
Yeah.
You know, and it truly does break my heart. And my point in this is not to beat up on the UK or like, oh, wave it in your face, but it does. I just look at that and and kind of and a lot of this happened. I think that the death of the Queen was kind of a bittersweet moment, especially for those who kind of were looking in from the outside. And on one hand, it was incredibly comforting that, like, oh, there's a little bit of old Albion there. There's a little bit of, a little England still alive.
Yeah.
But after that, everything, went back to normal. And you have, these kind of like radical Black activists, erecting, statues of murderers in London. And, you have, kind of the revival of, all of the, like the horror stories that, we've seen coming from the UK, specifically with, migrant sex crimes and all that. And look, like, I get it. Like, it's the news. I don't know what it's like to live there, but I do feel this kind of immense sense of loss, because recently I've been kind of going through my own genealogy. And I knew this to a certain degree, that I'm essentially 100%, founding stock American, right? Like the earliest ancestor I have is, which I realize is in the European sense is not all that long ago, but is an indentured servant who essentially made it to Virginia in 1620, most likely out of a prison in the UK. And there is something to be said that, that American culture is kind of a continuation of British culture, especially that kind of founding stock. And so while I don't mean to say that I feel it to the same degree as someone who, who was born there, who kind of lived there, but it is, I mean, there was so much has been lost already, and it would be, I mean, tragic is not nearly the word to describe it. If the whole country essentially is just submerged in gray goo.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not the whole country; it's the cities, effectively.
Yeah.
So, I mean, where I live, I mean, I did live in London for 20 years, and then I had young children. I just thought there's no way I'm raising children in London, because it was clearly heading in the direction that it was not of my people anymore. And so I moved out to the former capital. So I'm down closer to Winchester now. The old sort of Anglo-Saxon roots of the country. And I've got to say, I mean, it's just absolutely fine around here. I mean, there's just genuinely isn't a problem. It's just like it's always been. But all of the things that I'm talking about, those silly people, lying down on roads and committing these sort of eco crimes and all the rest of it, and all the rest of it. I mean, it is entirely a city-based problem. So actually, possibly I was unfair to America earlier when I sort of talked about the sort of sensible triangle, sort of overlaid on the country. I mean, actually, my understanding is, even if you take somewhere like New York, if you exclude the city element, the upstate bit of New York is perfectly sensible people, and this sort of applies to it. I mean, even in the inverse, you go to Texas. Austin is just a liberal hellhole.
Yeah.
Everything else. So I mean, maybe there's some other dynamic going on here. Maybe it's maybe it is just a city problem and that it's been exacerbated by the excessive immigration that our political leaders have liked to put on us. And
that's one of the things that and this is an idea I stole from Thomas 777, who I'm good friends with, and he essentially brings something up that kind of the city as it exists now, it doesn't really make sense anymore. It's kind of an artifact from a previous era.
Yeah.
Because in a time in which there really is no onshore manufacturing in the West anymore. And look, I realize that there is, but not really, not in the sense that there used to be. These kind of sprawling urban centers are kind of no longer fit for purpose. These were really intended as worker barracks. And so there really has been this odd move to kind of try and prop cities up, and I think that a lot of decay that we've seen in urban centers really, I mean, and obviously maybe, you could play, counterfactuals all night, but I think it's just kind of inevitable as, society has changed. So that's always one thing that I do think about, that these kind of odd metropolises have been kind of rebranded as, like lifestyle centers for the young and glamorous, but really like they don't make sense anymore.
Yeah, so that is the possible white pill that I see coming out of this. So to give an extreme example of the point you were just making, for 20 years I lived in London, but I worked in something called the City. So in London we have an area which we call the City, which is basically a square mile in a central sort of eastern part where all the sort of the finance takes place, and all of the banks and all of the lawyers they basically cluster around this area. And there's a logic to it. And the logic is that, say you're doing a deal, and then something goes wrong at 4 o'clock on a Friday. Within 20 minutes, you can get your side, their side, their lawyers, your lawyers, the client's lawyers. You can all get in a room within 20 minutes, and you can sort of thrash out things. So that logic makes absolutely perfect sense in effectively a sort of a pre-COVID, a pre-digital era. And maybe the seeds of our rebirth have already occurred. So with the pandemic, it basically accelerated us 20 years on the whole, work from home or the work remote thing. Everybody is now comfortable with it. Even the people who say, no, I want you to come into the office, they've all got it set up so that they can do it if they need to do it. So now that the underlying logic has changed, people will gravitate out of those cities, and the only people who want to stay in them are basically the ones who basically need to be kept in the asylum, the true radicals, the people who think that they're sort of getting real value for it. But the value creators are going to say, no, I'm going to move out of here. And you can accentuate that trend. So I mean, let's say that 3D printing goes the way that it could go over the next 20 years. The need to be in a city in order to get and the distribution channels that evolve as well. The ability to get hold of something at short notice might be equally as viable in rural Virginia as it is in any sort of city base. So maybe the trends for our renewal have already started to occur, because when people move out of those cities, the value creators move out of them. Maybe the reason why people in cities are the way they are is because the logic of living on top of people, and knowing that you've sort of got the police 5 minutes away and therefore you don't need a gun. And as people sort of move into the real world, their perspectives will change and their politics will change. So maybe the seeds of renewal are already there and they're starting to take place. I don't know if that's the case, but it is a possible white pill.
One of the other things that I think about is that there's a kind of a famous essay, but admittedly kind of normie con writer, but it's nonetheless interesting. And the essay is called Luxury Beliefs. And his point is essentially that many of the things that people kind of profess to believe are things that they don't actually act on in their life. They just kind of say to sound, high status and fashionable. And one of the things that I hope, and look, South Africa exists, and there are still, kind of like middle-class white people, going along with their luxury beliefs, despite, kind of like the crumbling of society around them. So maybe that's a vain hope. But nonetheless, my hope is that as things get worse, as belts have to tighten, the amount of people who are kind of willing to stand for this nonsense will, go down, right? Like it's much less easy to kind of justify, harming your kind of like energy efficiency. I mean that in a sense of production, not in like the eco sense. When, realistically, like everyone's fine. It doesn't matter if your energy cost goes up 10% because, everyone is in a good enough spot economically that, it's a minor inconvenience. Whereas, if you're, looking down the barrel of and I realize that this might not be this winter, but, if current trends continue, next winter, the one after that, or it's a situation where there will be no heat, or if it is, it's, prohibitively expensive. And that's a situation where, kind of all like the niceties that we've gotten so used to debating over the last 30 years, I mean, really longer than that, there is something that I'm not sure how many of those ideas survive kind of contact with real material wants.
Yeah. So that is the assumption that these people have. I mean, it's almost a sort of a meme from sort of 5 years ago that, all of these sort of student radicals were, protesting capitalism on their $1,000 iPhone 3 or whatever it was, 5 years ago. These people assume that everything they see around them is a given and cannot be taken away, and therefore you can sort of overlay socialism on top of it and you're not going to get an issue. So, I mean, Germany is a prime example of this. They have a $2 trillion economy, and they thought that was a given. No, it wasn't. That 2 trillion economy was based on 30 billion of cheap Russian gas. And if you knock out that underlying level, you'll discover that the rest of it goes away. And actually, I think that the coming economic collapse, even though it will force an enormous reset for the influence of the nominally Anglo people, as I suppose, the UK, the Western European Alliance and US are sort of really heading this. As much as it would be a global reduction of our influence, probably the very best thing that could happen for our people and our culture is that financial reset happens. It will be less easy traveling about the world. It will be less easy for us, for our exporters, to ship around the world because, at the moment, the global American empire. I mean, it is malign in its influence, but it allows shipping channels to take place freely all over the world. So it's going to be a cost for this going, but for our culture and for our people, I'm open to the idea that actually, I might be reading in a history book in 30 years' time that the great collapse of 2028 was the very best thing that could have happened for our people.
Well, and there are several things there, and I think that that's insightful, which is one that whenever you hear these kind of like surveys of, migrants, right? Like number one, it's essentially, it's Gibbs, right? Like people want free money. They want, what they think is, enhanced economic opportunity.
Yeah.
And as rough as it sounds, well, if there's no economic opportunity to be had, if times are tough, maybe that problem solves itself. Maybe that's pie in the sky, but it's something to kind of hope for. And I think there's something else there, which is that the left, is, we can kind of speak most broadly, has kind of made a devil's bargain for realistically the last, I would argue, in the US, almost since its inception as a country, has kind of made this bargain where they said, all right, we will trade corruption to the system, breaking the rules, bending the rules, for power and money. And every time they were able to kind of, eke out a good deal, getting more power and money than they lost in corruption to the system. But now it kind of seems like they've run out of the amount of power they can get. They've hit the point of diminishing returns, where they're getting with more and more corruption, and the corruption that they kind of paid with, 2 or 3 generations ago, is catching up to them, and catching up to them fast. And as the money printer starts to fall apart, and as the power starts to dissipate, all that's left is the corruption. And I think that we've seen it, and admittedly, look, like it's eating us too. Like the fabric of society decaying affects everyone. But I look at the people in power and I'm like, you are desperate. You are acting like you have like you were afraid of.
Oh yeah, it is proper wounded animal type time at this point. Yeah. But again, this is why, and I sometimes think about, what is the right thing for me to do with my family? Is it to stay in Britain because I understand this system? Well, and I am staying here because I'm going to fight. I'm fighting on every front that I can. So rather than going back to a well-paid finance role, instead what I'm doing is I'm spending all of my time blogging. I'm raising issues. I'm hopefully about to join a sort of a podcasting entity over here again to do everything that I can. I'm getting involved in some of the newer parties in order to push back on every level. So I'm gonna give it my all. But at some point, if this country if it continues to go the way that it looks like it's going, then I will bug out. And I think the US is. I can't go to the US now. I'd get turned away at the airport if I tried to come now because I'm unvaccinated. But the US is in a really strong position. It has everything it needs. It has all the agriculture and the energy and the security and the people. If there is a sort of a grand economic collapse, it will suffer on some rare earth minerals, and it probably won't get all of the imports of luxury goods that it might like from around the world in terms of spice and so on. But it will be fine. So positive for it, but there does need to be that sort of fundamental realignment, and it feels like we are living through that at the moment. I'm pretty sure that when we read the history book, when we won't be reading them, but when people read the history books in 100 years' time about the sort of the collapse of the Anglo-sphere, I think the date of that collapse will be given before 2022. And it will just be said to have occurred. I don't know when it would have occurred. I mean, a possible date would be the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I can see future historians citing that as the example of when the Anglo-sphere fell, and it will probably take the next few years, and it become obvious at some point that this period of domination, this sort of unipolar world, is over.
Yeah, that's something that I think about often. That it when you read history, it seems very much like things have kind of definite starts and ends, where that's much less likely to be, kind of like a reality on the ground. And that is actually a thought that I very explicitly had. Will this be the first chapter in the fall of the American empire? Will the book start, in February 2022? It's an interesting thought. But anyway, Dan, we're coming up on time. So do you want to get any of your plugs out before we wrap things up?
No, I mean, like I say, as I mentioned earlier, the way to follow me at the moment is Twitter, KingBingo_, which is a silly name, but I mean, I picked it 12 years ago because I thought that Twitter wouldn't last 5 minutes, and it turned out that it did. So yeah, follow me on that, and if I get the other thing away, then I'll be posting about it, and you can follow perhaps more regular content from me there.
And I should say, as a relatively recent discoverer of your work, I'm a big fan. Your Twitter feed is great, and it's one of the few things that really, I guess, justifies using that hell site. So anyway, guys, yeah, that's quite a compliment. Anyway, guys, my links will be down in the description as well. This episode will not only be on YouTube, it will also be on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio-only podcasts. And the way that works is that the most recent 10 episodes of my show are available for free on Apple and Spotify. And then if you want the audio only versions of my backlog, it's $5 a month on my Substack, just a way for me to kind of offset the cost of this. It will always be free on my YouTube, so long as I have a YouTube channel. And I also have, a few other links so you guys can find my Twitter, and anything else you guys want to follow me on. And again, thank you so much, Dan, for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed talking to you.
All right, guys. And remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night, everyone.